What's going on, everyone? John Matrix here. Hope you're all having yourselves a wonderful day. We're going to be jumping back into the Kaiserreich Universe today with documentary episode number 4. What if Russian white forces had won the Civil War? Kaiserreich Universe Documentary episode 4, Russia. That is what we're going to be getting into and covering here today. Links will be down below in the description, as always, to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to Kaiser Cat Cinema's channel. We've been enjoying going through and doing this documentary so far, so I'm looking forward to continuing and seeing what's going to happen in this episode. So if you've been enjoying this content as you've been going along through it with us, you know, give this video a like and check out the man's content on his channel and give him a sub if you've been enjoying it. If you'd like to join us as we're doing these reactions live, as you can see, we're doing this live right now with my YouTube members. There is a join button underneath the video, as well as a link in the description to the YouTube membership benefits and tiers that I offer. If you've been around the channel for a while, decide you want to take your sport to the next level, check those out and see if you would have any interest for it. But with all that said, let's get into the video here, boys. Boop, boop, boop. So, I mean, on the last episode, just a quick brief recap, we got into essentially the spread of syndicalism into Britain, and how a British Revolution took place, and how syndicalism really took over, and how, interestingly enough, syndicalism in Britain actually went to an extremist level where some factions of it almost kind of got to like German SS levels of, you know, radicalism, seemingly. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, what's going to happen here with Russia in this alternate history.
We are proud to announce our new video sponsor, Supremacy 1914. The kind people over at Bytro Labs saw that we were raising funds for our alt history videos and stepped in to help with their own alt history game. Grand Strategy fans will feel right at home in Supremacy 1914, which allows you to control any nation during a Great War setting. The twist is, the game is fully online and hosts up to 500 players simultaneously. It's a great Grand Strategy game that can be played on both mobile and browser.
Interesting.
With a 4.4 rating on Google App Store, I can warmly recommend Supremacy 1914. You can join using the affiliate link in the description to get 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only valid for 30 days, so make sure to decide fast. And now,
well, there you go.
Enjoy the show.
Check out a sponsor.
It was once said that Russia is an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a riddle. Such a phrase speaks eloquently to the Western sense of Petrograd as the other, an inscrutable and menacing land that plays by its own rules. A hard land, with hard climate and hard people.
It's true.
It would seem only fitting that a nation like
live.
Russia would suffer such tragedies in the 20th century.
There's a reason why one of the rules of war is never invade Russia in the winter.
And yet, continue to rise from them. Every time the Russian bear would return again, every time stronger, more menacing, more united. For the Kaiser in Europe knows his true enemy lies east, as it always has. There will be another war over Eastern Europe, that much is certain.
Yeah.
But if Germany is unlucky, she may have to fight 2 revanchist powers at once.
See, and I mean, that's always one of the things in Central Europe that's been like the biggest issues is you're always surrounded one way or the other. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I mean, like rewind back here. So it's like Germany's still consolidating their victory from World War I. Do they push in and try to, you know, remove the syndicalist threat that's going on here that eventually will probably start another world war, and then risk being attacked from Russia? Or do they go and try to take Russia while this movement's still kind of in its infancy, and then hopefully once, you know, they're able to, if they're able to actually take Russia, then have essentially only one front to have to face, and you know, the syndicalist uprising. Or, you know, if they move in and try to take Russia and fail, then they've used all the resources, and again, they're open to attack on all sides, essentially. So it's It's kind of a rough predicament, really, to be in strategically, you know?
But if Germany is unlucky, she may have to fight two revanchist powers at once. Caught between the rise of Western syndicalism and a resurgent Russia, a trap is closing on the Kaiser. Germany may soon face a new Russia. A Russia united under one people, one nation, one Vozhd. The turn of the 20th century would be marked by...
Yeah, you better not spoil anything, Kelshman. You're going to have the comments coming after you again, brother. You're going to have the pitchforks out.
By a series of military defeats and economic turmoil that would shake the foundations of the Russian Empire and her Romanov rulers. Japan's humiliation of the ostensibly much stronger Russia in the 1904 Russo-Japanese War caught the attention of many Russians, who saw this defeat as a metaphor for the failures of the Romanov dynasty. In 1905, a first popular revolt raged through the massive Russian Empire. This liberal revolution would ultimately be silenced, but not without minor reforms. More importantly, it would plant in the hearts of the Russian people a seed of disobedience and resistance against the ruling status quo. The population of Russia had long suffered under the yoke of serfdom and inept rule by an out-of-touch aristocratic class. As the years progressed, however, things went from bad to worse. Russia lurched into the 20th century, failing to modernize both politically and economically, staying behind other European powers in industrialization. In the vaunted halls of London, Berlin, and Paris, it was whispered that Russia was a house of glass, magnificent, but a single crack could send her tumbling down. Words that would forebode the dark future awaiting the vast empire. When Tsar Nicholas unilaterally declared war on Germany in defense of Serbia in 1914, he unknowingly sparked a worldwide calamity that would later be known as the Great War. At the start of his Weltkrieg, the Kaiser made it a priority to crush France before turning his army east. While Russian fighting spirit was unmatched, the Russian army would soon find themselves to be outmatched by the technologically superior German army. The wars of the 20th century would be decided by the range of artillery and communication lines, a difficult task for the vast and sparsely industrialized areas of the Russian.
Because, I mean, from what I understand, again, I'm no, historical expert on war, but what he was talking about there with artillery and communication lines, from what I understand, during World War II, the initial invasions that Germany had against France, France actually had superior weaponry, but they didn't have radios. And so a lot of the German tank divisions were able to simply just outmaneuver them because they were able to communicate in more real time. And I mean, that makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference.
Russian front. Still, the outmatched Russians fought tenaciously as they were driven out of Poland and Galicia. Many of these stories would ascend to become legendary tales of heroism, such as the March of the Dead Men. Despite such propaganda victories, the war would push Russia's straining resources and military to the breaking point. As famines ravaged the hinterland, soldiers began deserting en masse. They would turn their attention in the opposite direction, taking their weapons to the Russian capital of Petrograd in a bid to secure better living conditions for the Russian people. The situation rapidly became untenable. It would not be long until soldiers and striking workers seized control of the capital and demanded the formation of a more democratic government. This uprising led to the...
It really is so interesting, this alternate timeline, that socialism, aka syndicalism, rose up, in France and kind of the heart of Europe, whereas democracy really has taken more of a root in the heart of Russia. It's fascinating how essentially opposites have really been happening.
The February Revolution of 1917, a series of strikes that saw the Tsar cede considerable power to a democratically elected parliament, or as Russians refer to it, the Duma. Chosen to lead this new democratic government was the notorious Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky was a lawyer and revolutionary who joined the provisional government by using the Socialist Revolutionary Party as a vessel. A pro-democracy proponent and free press advocate, Kerensky had the ambition of using the crisis to transform Russia into a modern democracy. However, the Germans saw this political instability as an opportunity to knock Russia out of the war entirely. With the support of German secret agents, the revolutionary Lenin was sent back into the country. Lenin's Marxist ideology began spreading like wildfire, and Kerensky soon found his own democratic institutions turning against him in a wave of popular revolt. Russia's population in 1917 was tired, hungry, and demoralized from year after year of non-stop defeat. Many began blaming Kerensky and the inept and corrupt military leadership for Russia's failures against Germany. Lenin's Marxist ideology found fertile ground among the discontented workers and soldiers of Russia. Soon they began organizing. They formed revolutionary councils, so-called Soviets, to pressure the Kerensky government into far-reaching concessions and land reform. These communist revolutionaries would become known as the Bolsheviks. As Lenin's Bolsheviks took control of more and more of the Kerensky government, they clamored for peace and bread. This defeatism was condemned by the Russian military elites, who hatched plans to remove the Bolsheviks from power by force. These rising tensions between government and military would lead to a fateful incident called the Kornilov Affair. By 1917, Russia's old guard military leadership was blamed for the country's continuous failures against the German Empire. Kerensky, pressured by rising Bolshevik sentiment, began replacing much of the chain of command. This gave initiative to lower-ranking generals and officers, such as one Lava Kornilov. Kornilov, born to a family of Siberian Cossacks in present-day Turkestan, had known a decorated military career. Kornilov served in the Russo-Japanese War, and later as military attaché in China. A staunch nationalist and military traditionalist, Kornilov would later go on to clash with the democratic Kerensky and Kolchak, and support the rising nationalist parties of Russia. Notorious for his hatred of the left and the Bolsheviks, Kornilov believed that Lenin's Petrograd Soviets formed a serious threat to Russia's capacity to fight the war. He hoped to remove the Soviets in one fell swoop, and began hatching a plan. In late 1917, General Kornilov sent a detachment of cavalry to pass.
The one thing that I wish, just going through these documentaries, I wish I just had more like historical knowledge of what real world events were, just so I could like make a correlation of like, oh, this is how things changed, you know, because a lot of these people and events, to my understanding, are real, but I don't have a broader like perspective on how the real world events happen, so I can like take in context how, I guess, big or maybe nuanced, depending on, you know, again, the context, some of these changes in history are, and how, you know, it could have shaped different events. I mean, some of the stuff, like obviously the rise of syndicalism and socialism in France and that, and leading to an entirely different, you know, system of governance throughout there in Britain, those are major events. But some of these like smaller events they're talking about with historical figures, which I'm assuming most of are real. Some of these figures could be, you know, figures that were created for this alternate history. I don't know enough again to know for sure, but it's just interesting, you know, seeing how these little events lead up to the big changes. And I just wish I knew some more about the real world events of these times, so I could kind of like correlate with real world events to this alt history kind of a thing, you know? I know way more World War II. Yeah, the same. I know a lot more about World War II than I do World War I. But it's also, as an American, that's like, World War II is kind of like America's claim to fame, you know, like that was our major, you know, victory and thing that set us up for what we are as a country today.
Pacify and secure the city of Petrograd, a Soviet stronghold. When Kerensky and his government caught wind of the coup, he was furious. The government considered Kornilov's actions a rogue initiative and promptly dismissed the general.
Gotcha.
In an unfortunate turn of events, Kerensky warned the Petrograd Soviets that Kornilov was approaching, prompting them to arm themselves and stop the oncoming attack. The Soviets did so successfully, and Kornilov was arrested. However, after the military coup was foiled, Bolshevik soldiers refused orders by the government to stand down. Instead, sensing weakness, the communists launched a coup of their own. This revolution would be later called the October Revolution and marked the start of the Russian Civil War.
So yeah, wasn't this like a real event? Didn't this really happen? Because I think I've heard that before.
As the Bolsheviks rallied large parts of the Russian army, the Russians turned their weapons on each other. Two large factions emerged at the start of the Civil War, the Communist Bolsheviks and the pro-government White forces that later united under Admiral Kolchak.
Gotcha, okay. So, essentially, whereas in real life, the Bolsheviks, I assume, are the ones that won and came to power and created, you know, the Soviet Union, they're going to talk about here how the White forces actually won in this alternate history and how that changed things, I'm assuming.
Alexander Vasilievich Kolchak was a popular and well-decorated Imperial Russian admiral. Having fought in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and the Great War, he became recognized as the supreme leader and commander of all White forces by 1918. Loyal to the Romanov dynasty, but also a pro-democratic Republican, Kolchak was a popular figure with both the nobles, general population, and the military. With Russia in crisis, White forces saw no better man to lead the war, even as the situation deteriorated rapidly. Red forces quickly took control of the Russian industrial heartland, pushing the Whites out to the fringes and Russian hinterland. More worryingly, Red forces intercepted the Tsar as he attempted to flee and imprisoned the royal family at Yekaterinburg. By the time Kolchak's White forces arrived there, they found only bodies. The execution of Tsar Nicholas and his family cratered White morale, but also rallied anti-Bolshevik sentiment in the White-controlled areas. Many moderates rose to condemn the brutal killing of the imperial family and painted Lenin as a tyrant and murderer. Ironically, not long thereafter, the Bolshevik leader would face a similar fate. In the summer of 1918, Lenin toured an arms factory in Moscow. When he approached the crowd to shake hands, a smiling woman reached out to him, drew a revolver, and shot Lenin through the chest. The Soviet leader dropped to the ground, dead upon impact. The assassin attempted to flee the scene, but was captured. She was later revealed to be Fanny Kaplan, a prominent anarchist in the Bolshevik coalition. The death of Lenin sent shockwaves through the Red Army. Rumors began spreading that Kaplan was working for another faction of the Red Front, and that the assassination was a plot to stop Lenin's growing influence. Kaplan was shot without trial 4 days later. Her legacy would be great, however. Lenin's death would be a seminal downturn in the political unity of the Soviets and the Red Army. Now that the playing field had been leveled, White forces rallied around several key individuals leading troops against the Bolshevik menace. Kolchak and Kornilov settled their grievances after the death of the Tsar and focused on the larger task of defeating the Red Army. The staunch Republican and his nationalist rival were soon joined by two other prominent figures from their respective parties, the Democratic Viktor Chernov and authoritarian Boris Savinkov. Viktor Chernov was a political leader from the Democratic SR party that was dominant in the Duma during the Civil War.
He's got the Aquila of the Emperor. We're back to 40K. It's all back to 40K here, baby.
Together with Kolchak, he advocated for a new Russian republic to emerge from the ruins of the Civil War. Savinkov, on the other hand, was a fanatic militarist suspected of several high-ranking assassinations and even terrorism. He was supported by Kornilov as being an effective statesman and grew popular with the soldiers and officers throughout the war. These four men would continue to clash over their differing visions for Russia, even throughout the Civil War.
I mean, yeah, you've got you got people in positions of power that are Democrats, and then you've also got authoritarians, etc. So, like, their ideologies are obviously going to clash with what they want to do with things. So it seems like, you know, the white forces, I guess, have like a tenuous alliance to deal with, you know, the Soviets, I guess, or what's left over of the Lenin's faction, the Bolsheviks. And then once that gets dealt with, there's probably going to be another civil war between Democratic parties and the authoritarian parties, right? Yeah, for sure.
They found common ground on one thing, however. Before all else, the Bolsheviks had to be destroyed.
Right.
Sensing weakness in the Red Front, the Western armies took Vitebsk and Petrograd and began contesting Smolensk. With shortages of food and equipment, the Reds were forced to retreat. This respite lasted for several months, allowing white forces to recapture key territories. The 1919 Spring Offensive, later made legendary as the Run to the Volga, saw Kornilov uniting his forces with the rest of the army rather than attempting his own offensive on Moscow. The Red counteroffensive against the Whites failed, and many point to this event as the moment in the Civil War where the balance tipped decidedly in favor of white forces. Political instability was not limited to the Red camp, however. As white leaders met for the second time at Ufa that year, a fierce political battle erupted over the need for military leadership. To keep the White Front united, Kolchak was forced to follow along with the cadets and SRs and cede considerable power to the nationalist Kornilov. The German Kaiser, fearing the communist uprising in the east, struck a secret deal with this military leadership through Ukrainian proxies. Through these backroom channels, Kornilov was promised German aid against the Red menace. While officially Russia and Germany would remain in a state of war, commanders on both sides were ordered to minimize and avoid open conflict.
Like, what is that hat? He's got, like, I don't even know what that is up there.
With the quiet backing of German forces, Red troops were forced to retreat further. The Red Army was wounded by shortages of food, munitions, and widespread desertions. The Whites saw their chance as the forward defenses of Moscow, capital city of the Russian Soviets, dissolved. By the middle of 1920, Moscow was assaulted on all sides by white forces. After fierce fighting, the city fell on August 31, 1920. What remained of the Red Army began a retreat to Arkhangelsk, where they were chased relentlessly. Those few foreign Bolsheviks who managed to escape the country retreated to friendly syndicalist nations such as France, and later, the Union of Britain.
The Russian Revolution failed partly due to the gullible nature of the Soviet leadership. After Lenin's assassination, Bukharin, Stalin, and Trotsky squabbled over control. And I should have known then we were doomed. At best, Trotsky was a gullible fool, and at worst, a soft-hearted idiot. The deaths of millions of Soviet citizens can be blamed on his inability to see the internal threats tearing the United Soviets apart. Even as the Whites pressed us out of Ekaterinburg and our Western Front collapsed, we were occupied mostly with political sideline arguments. The anarchist wing of the party infected the Soviets like a cancer, planting in the men imbecilic and unsustainable ideas of a future in Russia without a government. Kolchak and Kornilov learned from our internal division and assembled a strong dictatorship to bring the Whites through the war.
Well, I mean, it also just goes to show how in situations like this, like losing a leader that essentially is unifying, you know, ideals and people, like what happened with Lenin, you know, with him being assassinated in this timeline, like makes a huge difference. It changes everything, you know?
I despise them for everything they stand for.
And then so because the Reds weren't able to have, they weren't able to unify under one leader, they fell apart, essentially, is what it sounds like here.
But in this, they were not wrong. When Moscow fell, we fled Russia as common criminals, hiding on freighters to Britain. While the revolution failed in Russia, the international brigades would survive and reorganize in the United Kingdom. After we helped the syndicalists topple the monarchy, the British Red Terror that followed was swift and effective. All voices of opposition within the party were silenced, and total control was established.
So they essentially kind of corrupted the idea of syndicalism and changed it into something else, which is probably why they became so radicalized over there in Britain, is what it seems like.
The difference between the Bolsheviks and the British Republicans was that the British were prepared to cut once and cut deep. I still hold that on the British Isles, thousands of lives were saved by sacrificing a few hundred. When we returned to Chicago, we vowed to remember the lessons we learned in Europe. When we began allying the various syndicates in the Greater Lakes area, we ensured no man would step out of line. Only a strong leadership figure could assure the success of the American Revolution. The combined syndicates would not fail where the Soviets had. We called this ideology one of total state control. Everything within the state. Nothing outside the state.
Totally,
Nothing
dude.
against the state. Total control. The name stuck. Later on, the party would call us the Totalists.
On the 28th of January 1921, white forces declared victory in Russia. To the surprise of many, Kornilov and the military did indeed relinquish their wartime powers by declaring that Petrograd would hold a great constitutional assembly. The victorious provisional government was reassembled under Alexander Guchkov, who became Russia's first president. But while one war had ended, another still loomed. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed between Germany and the Bolsheviks, not the white government.
Yeah.
This meant, technically, Russia and Germany were still at war. White Russia's preoccupation with her civil war had seen German interest directed westward for most of the latter half of the war. First to break the Entente outside Paris, and then to guard against the unprecedented French syndicalist revolution. The radical militarist and nationalist factions, spearheaded by Savinkov, believed this was the perfect opportunity to continue the war against a distracted and exhausted Germany. Their hastily prepared and highly unrealistic plan involved a rapid campaign to recapture Russia's breakaway provinces. To the democratic government, however, the continuation of the largest war in human history, on the heels of a civil war no less, was nothing short of madness. Order had not yet been restored across Russia's vast territories. Famine was widespread, and the country was on the verge of economic collapse. This provisional government approved the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, originally negotiated by the fallen Bolshevik government on the 13th of October 1921. While this was a sound move to any reasonable observer, in nationalist circles the treaty was seen as an incredible humiliation. By signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the democratic government accepted the very defeatism of the Bolsheviks they defeated just months earlier.
I mean, I could see that point of view, right? Like, they were literally fighting against the Bolsheviks, and now they're accepting the terms that were imposed by on the Bolsheviks at the end of World War One. So they, like, even though they won, they're also admitting defeat. But at the same time, like you're saying, dude, you've got a country that still isn't unified. You just got over a civil uprising and civil war, you gotta establish, you know, a unified front before you could even think about setting things off again. And especially, you know, at the time right now, like they had mentioned, Germany is really focused on the eastern side of things with the syndicalist uprising, as they're seeing, you know, they're feeling like that's most likely where any kind of battlefront's going to take place. So, I mean, I feel like at this point in this timeline for Russia, it would be a smart idea to take your time, consolidate your power, you know, reestablish things, get the populace behind you, and rebuild your military, modernize it, you know, et cetera, and then prepare for whatever's to come, whether that be, you know, get a plan established for what you want to get back, essentially, and then go from there. I think that would probably be the smart idea, you know.
It was in these turbulent times that Savinkov began his political rise. The nationalist had emerged in the Duma.
But at the same time, like, I can understand how publicly it looks like, yeah, they're capitulating, and how that could, to the populace, after, you know, just getting over a civil war, them signing a treaty that sparked a civil war, how that could look.
As a popular, fiery orator, promising everything to everyone.
Ratifying a treaty, whatever you want to say.
Further land reform to the peasants, reconquest to the revanchists, and strong leadership to those convinced of Russia's failings. In 1924, he broke with his former party, the right-wing SRs, and formed his own SZRS party. This Motherland Party incorporated both social revolutionaries and cadets who struggled to find a political home. Savinkov's new Party of the People quickly attracted burgeoning support from the peasantry, student intelligentsia, and nationalist groups.
Well, and that seems to be like the theme of the time, right? Is like parties of the people, where people are starting to really take back power from their governments that have let them down and abused their power and not done anything for the common man. Now the common man is standing up and revolting, you know, and it's having profound effects throughout the world.
To the Russian populace, Savinkov seemed like a bold leader for a difficult era. Many began to refer to him as the leader, or as it is called in Russian, the Vozhd. By 1925, Russia's troubles had only worsened, as inflation truly spiraled beyond control. Economic ties to the United States, once a source of strength, quickly became a liability, as the Wall Street crash sent the American economy stumbling. Soon, the Russian government found itself forced to turn to the hated Germans for aid, a situation epitomized by the 1926 Vilnius Agreement. The agreement provided a framework for broad German investment across Russia, which would pave the way for industrialization yet unseen in the country. To opponents like Savinkov, however, this was yet another defeat, a desperate measure taken at the cost of Russian sovereignty. Not only had the democratic government signed the humiliating Peace of Brest-Litovsk, they were now also subjecting themselves to the very German influence that cost them control over Eastern Europe. The more Russia struggled, the stronger Savinkov grew. The 1927 elections would bring more seats for his party, soon followed by a sweeping propaganda victory. Worried by the election's results, the SRs and cadets had introduced legislation to stifle and politically disarm the Motherland Party. The move had exactly the opposite effect. Now armed with legitimate complaints of unjust censorship and repression, Savinkov unleashed a barrage of accusations against the government.
A barrage.
Soon the legislation failed, and Savinkov emerged stronger than ever. Still, he and his Motherland Party remained on the political fringe. It would take something greater yet to propel him from the backseat of the Duma into the halls of the Kremlin. Fortunately for Savinkov, despite all Russia's troubles, worse was yet to come. This time it would be a humiliation all too familiar, and on all too familiar a field: the rolling hills of Manchuria.
Really?
The Chinese Eastern Railway, or CER, running from the city of Chita in the Russian Far East to the city of Harbin in the heart of Manchuria, had been a matter of dispute since the early days of the Civil War nearly a decade before. In early 1927, a minor incident at the border city of Manjuli quickly escalated. Neither Russia nor Jiang Zuolin's Chinese authorities were entirely clear on how to respond. The Russian Far Eastern District under General Konstantin Sakharov was only partially mobilized, and Jiang's forces were fiercely engaged with the Jili clique to the south. As negotiations dragged on and eventually proved futile, the SR cadet government recognized an opportunity, not just to strengthen their position over the railway, but also to beat Savinkov at his own game. With the government's blessing, General Sakharov hastily amassed 200,000 troops, 50,000 of whom were soon marching across the border at Manjuli.
It's interesting. So, like, the whole time they've been really preparing for and gearing up for a retaliatory strike against Germany to try to retake lands that were in things that were lost during World War I. And now a whole other front and situation has opened up on the Chinese border, and they're getting ready to go to war with China now?
The Chinese fought a fighting retreat, but soon the Russians had secured all of Halar and settled in as an occupying force north of the Greater Khingan Range. Still fighting a war to the south, the situation would only worsen for Jiang with the end of summer, as a Russian flotilla crushed a Chinese riverine armada on the Amur, and detachments of Cossacks began to raid into the countryside. The Japanese, with their own agenda, thus far refused to intervene. After 2 victories and no responses from the Japanese, Russian forces grew bolder. Sakharov was convinced that the war could be pursued past mere border skirmishes. The arrival of winter gave him a chance to redeploy both himself and some of his best forces into the Primorye. Following the early thaw of 1920,
I mean, it's a lot of territory. Like, I don't know. I also don't know enough geographically, like, from the Russian side of things going south into China, like, how difficult a territory that is to also take. Like, I don't know where the mountain ranges and all that stuff kind of take effect, and how difficult it would be for, you know, Russia to push into China. From what I understand, on the far western side of stuff, that might not be quite so difficult, because I think it goes into flatter land towards the west. Because I think during World War II, or prior to, or maybe even a little after, there were some skirmishes between Russia and China and Russia and Japan, you know, along those the western fronts near the Pacific side of things. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know geographically enough to know, like, how difficult it would be for Russian forces to push in and how much territory they'd be able to seize, you know? Plus, obviously, I have no idea what each side's forces are really capable of at this time, although we're still, from the Russian perspective, they're still kind of recovering from not only World War I, but from a civil war. You know, they're still not a united government at this point. Keep in mind, at this time of the scenario, China wasn't one country, it was a bunch of warring states. Right.
28, Sakharov swept aside the Chinese forces left to guard the frontier and began his march westward, largely following the Trans-Siberian Railroad, toward his first objective on the road to Harbin, the cities of Mundanjeng and Ning'an. However, not all was well in Sakharov's camp. An unexpected snow squall in mid-March drastically slowed the advance and grounded his reconnaissance aircraft. The narrow front of advance had likewise turned much of his army into a snaking column, navigating the valleys through which the railway had been built. Worse yet, the unreliability of the dizzying array of radios the Russians were using meant communications, poor and largely unencrypted to begin with, had broken down within a week of the offensive.
Well, it also sounds like, from what he's talking about, with them essentially only being able to push in as far as the established rail line is allowing them to, that also makes it very easy for their supply lines to be cut. Like if any of the Chinese forces could somehow even get a small skirmish, you know, around to derail the rail lines and cut off any kind of supplies coming in, that could be very no bueno for the Russian forces.
Forcing Sakharov to rely on messengers. Finally reaching Mundanjiang almost a week behind schedule, Sakharov's forces began making quick progress. Momentum was soon lost, however, as the defending Chinese forces proved stronger than expected. Sakharov's incredulity would soon turn to horror as frantic messengers began arriving from his rearguard. Though no two reports agreed with each other, what was clear was that a catastrophe was brewing. Simultaneously, and at several different points along the column, Sakharov's army had come under attack by an unknown ambusher with surprisingly modern equipment.
Exactly what I was just talking about.
When Russian forces saw the ambushers bear down upon their rear, their flag came into view. With shock and horror,
Japanese.
Sakharov realized he was facing an old enemy. Flying over the ambushed army were the colors of the rising sun.
I mean, that's kind of smart, honestly, from the Japanese point of view. Let these two forces fight it out. Let them exhaust their resources and extend supply lines, and then come in when they're weak and take the territory and resources for yourself.
The Empire of Japan had finally responded. The Japanese Kwantung Army had observed Sakharov's buildup of forces in the Primorye with great interest. When both scouts and intercepted radio transmissions proved his intentions without a doubt, the Japanese launched into action. Aware of the Russians' avenue of advance, Japanese infantry had made a difficult trek into the highlands south of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, ready to strike as soon as Sakharov's troops stalled at Mundanjiang. Others, wearing Chinese uniforms, had taken up positions in the city itself. The results were immediate and decisive. Overstretched and taken completely by surprise, Sakharov's rearguard was routed. Despite attempts to turn his forces around and punch through the encirclement, the breakdown of supplies, command, and morale left only a foregone conclusion. After a week of further futility, Sakharov bitterly resigned himself to surrender. Nearly 30,000 soldiers of his Special Primorye Corps were captured, wounded, or killed in the field.
Including himself.
The defeat was a political disaster for the SR cadet government. For all the damage years of symbolic defeats had done, and for all they had hoped to gain from a quick and easy victory, an actual defeat in the field was something else entirely. Unsurprisingly, Savinkov was quick to capitalize on the debacle. Russia had yet again been humiliated, and the government could not have been more unpopular. Seeing the writing on the wall, Democratic-leaning General Vasily Boldyrev attempted a preventative putsch in 1929, hoping for support from the SRs and cadets, hoping to use a combination of military might and political power to decisively crush the Motherland Party once and for all. The necessary support never came. Instead, the Russian government began what would later become known as the Christmas Purge, a sweeping series of forced retirements and
that just sounds evil. The Christmas Purge, brother.
Executions, targeting allies of both Boldyrev and Savinkov. Boldyrev fled the country, and once again Savinkov railed against the government, letting fly accusations of tyranny and repression. According to Savinkov, only a weak government would fear those who had served and bled in its name. Only a weak government would resort to such violent, extreme measures.
Boldyrev, the traitor, they call me now. Boldyrev the exiled. Boldyrev, who sits in Georgia wringing his hands, plotting the downfall of Great Russia. You fools! My loyalists and I are the only ones up to the task of protecting Russia. Look around you, brothers. Do the silver skulls and black uniforms not remind you of the oppression of the Okrana, the Romanov dynasty, the mass hysteria of the Bolshevik Revolution? Does it matter whether the flags they wave are black or red? They are snakes choking the foundations of the Russian Republic either way. They say I have no popular support. They say I am an arrogant figment of Russia's past. I do not have the people's support, because I am not a lying snake like Savinkov, dripping ornate words into their ears with a knife behind his back. Out here in Georgia, we dodge his assassins on a weekly basis. I am pushed to the fringes, made politically mute and hunted, but I survive. The dream of a Russian democracy survives with me. Savinkov controls the radio. Savinkov controls the newspapers. Savinkov controls the army. Slowly his black tendrils wrap around the last vestiges of democracy and freedom in Russia, and you are all too blind to see it. Like bleating sheep, his motherland party will lead you all to slaughter. I organized the Poch as a last-ditch attempt to remove Savinkov's influence from the apparatus of state. But I fear it may already be too late. Savinkov has once again succeeded in painting his opponents as enemies, and once more the Russian populace wades deeper into his lies. There is a specter haunting Russia. It is the specter of national populism, and me and Viktor Chernov are the last man able to stop it.
I couldn't imagine being a citizen living in Russia during this time period, right? I mean, just think about this alternate history in this time period. World War I just happened. You know, they got through a civil war with how many different political ideologies have taken place in their country and have been uprooted and destroyed and changed. You know, you had socialism with, you know, Lenin taking power and then him assassinated and the Soviets getting wiped out, and now you've got both democracy and authoritarian forces. Their power keeps waning back and forth. Yeah, the looming threat of Germany still. And now there's a war that's taken place with one of the Chinese factions that then gets supplanted with a devastating loss to the Japanese coming in and invading and taking territory and capturing one of your political leaders and 30,000 men. And it's looking like another potential uprising that could lead to another civil war happening. Like, could you imagine just being a citizen of that country at that point in time, man? Like, just trying to be a normal human being and live your life sounds like, it just sounds terrible at that point in Russia. Your comment didn't show up here in chat, so let me read this here. Yeah, he basically spelled it right there. Savinkov and his party are this world's version of fascists. They're authoritarian national populists who use the instability in Russia to seize power, right? So, I mean, like, it's a rough time to be a Russian, man.
In the end, despite all the allies he had lost in the purge, Savinkov gained politically. Bolstered by the backlash against the government and the disastrous defeat in Manchuria, the Motherland Party would go on to perform exceptionally well in the 1930 elections.
That's kind of crazy.
Well enough to...
That's actually pretty crazy. Like, with all of that and a huge defeat, they still had a lot of populace. They still had, you know, a lot of political popularity.
Compete directly with the other parties. 2 years later, in 1932, the violent repression of the Tambov Peasant Revolt would prove yet another arrow in Savinkov's political quiver. Economic mismanagement had driven the people to take what he called desperate measures, and they had been met in return by violence. Increasingly, the press ran with Savinkov's words. This time, the government were called butchers. By 1934, as Russia's countless peasants continued to struggle,
right,
and the government found itself buried...
Right, yeah, he twisted the events and was blaming it on other people. Similar to another historical, person of significance during that time.
Under scandal after scandal, the political winds had begun to shift. One by one, politicians began to defect to Savinkov's side, as much out of self-preservation as genuine political belief. Soon, where other right-wing parties had once been careful to avoid association with the Motherland Party, they began to court Savinkov's attention openly. Then, in the Duma elections of that year, the decisive moment came. The Motherland Party gained more seats than any other, which soon became an absolute majority, thanks to a newly announced coalition with the conservative Assembly of Russian Unification. Savinkov, once nothing more than a dissident and a terrorist, was sworn in as President of the Republic on October 4, 1934.
Damn.
As Savinkov entered the Kremlin, his opposition withered and weakened. Kolchak and Kerensky, leaders of the Democratic Front, had left the political scene some time earlier. Kerensky disappeared almost wordlessly. Blamed for the failings of the Democratic Front in the 1920s, the former head of government had finally had enough. The last known recording of Kerensky was from him boarding a ship towards the Americas, noting to the present journalist that he had suffered enough for Russia.
From what it sounds like in history, he's not going to find anything a whole lot better over there in America, but whatever.
Kolchak, for his part, had become Minister of the Navy and grew resentful of the bickering of the Petrograd political scene. Savinkov, ever the savvy political operator, ensured Kolchak would harbor no ideas of returning to prominence by vastly increasing his naval budgets. Kolchak now saw almost bottomless funding for the admiral's life passion, the pursuit of Arctic exploration. With Kolchak sailing off across the North Pole, another pawn was moved off Savinkov's board. In the following months and years, Savinkov gradually amassed and centralized his power, both within the government and without it. In the Duma, he had already begun to sideline his coalition allies, and soon only one real opponent remained, Viktor Chernov, democracy's last defender, who had since rallied an alliance of minor opposition parties and other interests against Savinkov's growing power. Still, the president's supporters spread violence in the streets and beyond. Already, those critical of Savinkov and his growing power had, more often than not, begun to slowly and silently disappear.
That tends to be how it happens, man. These people tend to disappear quietly. No one knows what happens to them. They just all of a sudden are gone, and then there's no opposition.
And whispers swirled that he was assembling an ideological police force, one to match or even exceed the old Tsarist Ukraina. The democratic ideals of the Russian Republic were wasting away at their very foundation. Soon, Chernov would become the only man standing in the way of Savinkov's total domination over the Russian state. Balancing between totalitarianism and democracy, Russia was a country on the brink. It would take only a single spark to light the powder keg.
I mean, yeah, you look at this. They've got all these different fronts of potential things. The Ottoman Empire still down here, Germans, Indian, Japanese, Chinese factions, etc.
To be continued.
Interesting. All right, well, there we have it. That was what if Russian White forces had won the Civil War. And I mean, it seems like they really kind of didn't. It seems like they really kind of didn't win the Civil War there, man. I mean, like I said, what a difficult time this would be to be just a Russian citizen, to be just an average person living in Russia, you know, dealing with the defeat of the Germans in World War I, and then this massive period of political turmoil that seems to have lasted, you know, a couple of decades, because they talk about it starting in the 1920s and then through the 30s and beyond. There's still this political turmoil, you know, with Lenin coming to power and the Bolsheviks, and then them being destroyed, with the united front between these authoritarian and democratic parties, and then them going at it, battle fronts and lines taking place all around you, with, you know, the looming threat of Germany and German influence and culture, starting to take root in Russia, and of course the threat of going to war against them at any time, and then having war fronts open up on the Chinese side of things, losing a huge defeat against them, and the Japanese getting involved, like, and then things just sprinting more and more out of control and looking like another civil war is about to happen between democratic and essentially what looks to be fascist parties. You know, that's just a rough time, man. That's a rough time that Russia's going through right now. So, but it's like I've said in the previous videos, it's just fascinating to see how these different things are playing out in this alternate history, and credit to the people that took the time to go through and put all this together with, you know, real people and real factions and real ideas and of how things would have turned out. So I'm eager to see moving forward in episode 5, you know, what's going to happen, what's the next faction we get into. I'm eager to see what's going to happen in America, but I don't think this documentary series has gotten that far yet. I believe the next one, from what I've seen on the list, goes back to what's going to happen to Germany after World War I, and after all of these different major political uprisings around them have taken place, and how it's affected them since the end of World War I. I believe that's what happens next, to my understanding. So I'm eager to check that out and see what's going to happen with that. But yeah, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Again, that was Kaiser Cat Cinema with episode 4 of this Kaiserreich Universe documentary, going over Russia and what would happen if the Russian Red Forces had won the Civil War. So yeah, links will be down below as always in the description to the original video without my commentary and reaction, and to Kaiser Cat Cinema's channel. So if you could please do me a favor, click those links, and if you enjoyed this video, go give it a like. And if you've been enjoying this documentary series so far, you know, go give the man a sub. If you'd like to join us when we do these reactions live, you know, we'd love to have you guys come and join the discussions and add your 2 cents. There is a join button underneath the video, as well as a link in the description to the YouTube membership benefits and tiers that I offer. You know, if you've been around the channel for a while and decide you would like to take your support to the next level, check those out and see if any of that would have any interest for you. But regardless, thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're having a wonderful day. If you did, consider leaving a like and a sub, as it helps me and the channel grow. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.